welcome everyone. And I do not know which episode of the DeAnxious podcast is this. So today we have a special guest. Well, you're going to be hearing a lot from him, so I guess he's not that special. Well, special in my own way. So, he's the creator of the program that most of you guys are probably familiar with if you're a member of DeAnxious Pro. Called Declutter. I've been friends with him for, 500 billion years or something like that. So I know him for a long, long time. And he has an interesting perspective on things like motivation, procrastination, depression, and even anxiety. And getting different perspective from all kinds of people is always helpful. So let's welcome him. And hey, how's it going, man?
Doing great, Wayne. How are you?
I am good. So I know you don't really do a lot of podcasts. So this is likely, one of your few firsts.
Yeah, definitely within the first 5, I think.
Yeah, it would be all right, if you screw up a lot or, you'd have to redo anything, we can fix that or maybe not. I don't know. Depends on how lazy we are. So tell me what you're up to these days.
So most of my time goes toward running my online marketing business. So I do a lot of affiliate marketing, primarily through paid traffic channels like Facebook ads, YouTube ads, search ads, TikTok, things like that. So that's the bread and butter of my kind of workday. And then other than that, I'm putting together a couple of more sort of long-term businesses with more assets and a little more staying power, including, as we talked about, the productivity, procrastination project and a few other things.
Right.
So that's what I do with my workday. When I'm not doing that, I'm either usually playing music or training MMA or sleeping.
You have a degree in music?
I have 2, actually.
Jesus Christ, I did not know that.
Yeah, and neither of them are useful, but it was fun.
Useful
it was
in
fun
their
to do
own way, I guess.
What I got out of it, the degree itself is not super useful, but the experiences and what I learned doing them certainly was. So,
yeah,
at least I got that.
Far more useful than an MBA, I'll tell you that.
I don't have one of those, so who knows?
Yeah. So you started as a copywriter. I remember all the way back, you used to post in forums and, stuff like that. And you worked as a copywriter quite successfully for some time. And then, you have to change your whole thing quite quickly, right? And when you're going through a pivot, it creates a lot of anxiety in those days and also depression, right?
Yes.
So I know, it took a long time for you to deal with it and come to terms with it and, developing tolerances. And, we're all super scared when you make that kind of pivot. So how did you handle it? Smoking a lot of weed and doing mushrooms?
So hypothetically speaking, I can neither confirm nor deny that psilocybin mushrooms and LSD were very useful tools in helping me deal with some of the anxiety and depression and things like that. Excuse me. I think, some of it is just getting through the day. And there's some days that's all you can do, And I think a lot of people really come down on themselves a little too hard because they'll look back on their day and kind of focus on all the things they didn't get done or all the things they wanted to do and didn't or should have done and didn't or the places they dropped the ball. And the reality of the situation is that sometimes all you can do is make it through the day. Sometimes success is just survival. And I think that can be true of almost any field or pursuit or hobby or things like that. Some days it's just not working out for you and you just have to deal with that. But I would say it was a multi-pronged approach. And of course it's always, I don't think you're ever finished learning or developing the skill. But for me, I definitely read a lot of books, listened to podcasts, had several great therapists over the years who really helped with some stuff.
You had great therapists, really?
I did, yeah. I was
Oh,
very lucky.
nice.
I had to go through a few to find them, actually.
All right. That's the thing,
But
with therapists. You have to go through a bunch to find the one that works for you. And many
it's a
people,
nightmare.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a
lack the
nightmare. And a
skills to
lot of
do that.
people
Right.
don't go to therapy because of that. Or
Yeah.
they're in therapy and they
Too,
kind of,
like
sorry, say that again?
it's expensive too, like if it's like $200 an hour or something like that, and that adds up.
Easily. Yeah. I mean, I live in Los Angeles, so like I've seen 300,
Jesus
350, numbers
Right.
like that. And, the thing about, there's that old saying, what do you call the guy who graduated bottom of his class in medical school? Doctor. There's a similar thing with therapists and psychologists, although they are less, there's even a lower standard there. So sometimes you'll find a really great therapist, but a lot of them just really don't seem to. A lot of the issue I found with a lot of therapy is that the therapists tend to be a little bit passive. They're just kind of like, oh, well, tell me about that, or how did that make you feel? And for some people, I'm sure that's very, very useful, especially in certain situations. There might be something that you really can't talk about with anyone else, that you can't talk about with your friends or your family or whatever. I'm sure you can, there's a bunch of different situations we could use for a placeholder there. But I think for most people, and certainly for me, just talking about it, I had plenty of people to talk to. That's not what I needed. What I needed was kind of practical advice and sort of steps or concepts or ideas to actually execute on to change my anxiety or productivity or executive dysfunction or whatever I was dealing with at the time. So I think that part of that is just, that comes down to you being really clear about what you need help with.
Right.
And being willing to be your own advocate. And I don't think this is just about therapy. I think this is kind of a self-development / self quote unquote healing thing overall. I treat the same thing with, when I've been to physical therapy, when I've been injured training MMA, when I've dealt with psychiatrists, whatever it is, you kind of, whilst most people are not trained professionals, I'm not a trained therapist, for example, I'm not a trained psychiatrist, but I'm also the one who lives with myself every day and has the best kind of understanding of what's going on with me, which means that I have to be the one to kind of spearhead my growth and development. And with a therapist, that kind of might look like you going to them and saying, hey, I need this or I need that. But I think a lot of people take a very passive approach to those kinds of things. And they just kind of go, well, they're the experts, so they'll know what's going on. And the truth is, experts make mistakes all the time because they're human.
Yeah, they have a lot of biases as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the good psychotherapists, at least in my experience, and I've worked with a lot in a professional setting. Well, not really a professional setting, more like, we got like a bunch of psychotherapists who designed some of these programs at DeAnxious for us. So what I know and I've noticed is a lot of them have biases. Their own biases are formed by their own experiences with their own, clients or their little world. And a good therapist would have their biases worked out in advance. And it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of work. And, it depends like what kind of clientele you've been exposed to. And it requires a lot of work, I guess. So,
it's enormous amount of work. And I mean, that the issue of, human biases comes up in all different sorts of aspects of our society, particularly in terms of like law enforcement or, our justice system, for example. But you also see it just in terms of like politics, in terms of everything. Humans are very biased. And even when we try not to be, we're going to be. So, the best therapists or psychotherapists or whatever will be pretty good at limiting that bias.
Right. And
they can never get rid of it,
Right.
And they're also, you're also dealing with human beings, right? So some days they will be quote unquote on and some days they won't. And you just like anyone else, you can't, when I go into my job, when you go into your job, when anyone goes into their job or anything else, when they're spending time with their family, they're driving to work, whatever, you're never going to be 100% on all the time. That's not realistic. And that's just not possible.
Right.
So you're going to have times you drop the ball. And when you're dealing with a therapist, that means that, hey, I just paid you $250 for this hour and kind of weren't really there. You might have been checked out.
Yeah,
You might have
there's
been
also like an element of specialization. Like, for example, when you go to a doctor and you have like a specific problem, the specific disease in your liver, you would go to a doctor who specializes in that specific thing, you know? And that's the same thing with therapists. So, yeah, you know, if you have a problem with certain mindset or a certain thing, you want to go to somebody who specializes in that. And that is not really easily available. Sometimes they're booked for like a long, long time, or, you know, you might just not have one available.
Yeah.
Like if you're in like not LA or New York or whatever.
Exactly. And the truth is, finding someone good is difficult enough, just if we take out everything else. Just like, so out of any 100 therapists that graduate from, you know, whatever school with a degree in therapy, you know, maybe, I don't know, like whatever that number is of them that are good versus bad, it might be like 5 of them or 10 of them or 20 of them are good, and the rest are, you know, just not even worth entertaining. And then out of that, you know, 5% or whatever, generally, if they're good, it doesn't take long for them to get booked out. And then you're going to be waiting months to see them if you can get it. And even then, they might be really good at what they do, but anyone who's ever, you know, developed a skill under coaching, you know, whether it's martial arts, whether it's music, I mean, those are my examples, but, you know, whatever it is, like, for example, I've trained with phenomenal MMA coaches who are just really, really good, not just at doing the sport, but explaining it. But they don't gel with me for whatever reason. My way of understanding things is too different to theirs. They can only explain things in one particular way, or they're good for someone with a, you know, maybe who's a little more intense than I am, or has a different style than I do, or something like that. So, and you know, there are so many more factors that go into this. Price is a big one. You know, anyone good who generally gets expensive. So you kind of come into this situation where you're like, it's just really, 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 really difficult to find someone who works for you, who is competent, who is affordable, and who is available. You know, it's a unicorn.
And it also starts with you taking initiative, right? A lot of people do not take initiative that, okay, I have this problem, I got to get rid of this. So if you go to a therapist with a mindset that you do not have a problem or whatever, it just kind of like hinders your ability to, you know, get rid of that problem, or just,
And I think on top of that, therapy is kind of the same as psychiatry and mental health in terms of it's completely self-reported. So in most other things, I mean, medicine, like actual physical medicine is a great example. You don't have to go to a doctor and say, hey, my leg hurts. They can do an x-ray and be like, okay, your leg's broken. Like we whether or not you tell us that, we have an objective way to measure that. And even in other things, like, again, going back to these examples, you know, music, someone else can listen to it. And while it's still subjective art form, they can kind of say to me, okay, well, I would do this or do that, or even the less subjective things. Hey, you flubbed this run, or that note was out of tune, or whatever it is, you know, or anything like that kind of comes into play. But when you're dealing with a therapist, the only thing they have to go on is what you tell them. Now, granted, you know, a good therapist will be, some therapists are better than others, and some people are better than others at kind of reading between the lines or using their intuition and going, okay, something doesn't quite fit here. Whether it's, you know, and some of that is training and some of that is just, you know, I mean, we've all kind of spoken to someone and being like, I don't think you're being honest about this. Or the harder one is, you believe you are being honest about this, but you're actually not. You know, you're not honest with yourself. So that radical self-honesty is really the first step to doing any of this stuff. And because of that, a therapist can, you know, even if they're really, really, really good, they can only really be as, their effectiveness is limited based on how accurate your reporting to them is, you know. And that's why things like mental health is mental health for psychiatrists is such a difficult thing, because they'll throw you on a drug and basically say, okay, come back in a month, how did it make you feel? And you have, you know, if you look into studies on stuff like memory, you find memory is a very malleable thing. You know, we create memories, we adjust memories, and we do it all without realizing, you know. A good example of this, I think they call it the Mandela effect. the most famous example being the Berenstain Bears, or was it the Berenstain Bears? To the point where some people believe they're alternate realities and whatever, which I think they're kind of bypassing Occam's razor there, that the simplest solution is, I guess I remembered this differently, and I guess other people did as well. But kind of my point here is that we are not always our own best. Developing that ability to observe and to report accurately is a skill that's developed, and it's a very important skill for pretty much anything that you want to be able to do, I think.
Yeah. And, like just going to a therapist with a purpose. Okay, you know what? I have anxiety. I have depression.
Definitely.
I got this problem with XYZ and I need to get rid of it. So I'm going to get professional help.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't really go to one with that kind of mindset. They're either, going to counseling because, they're feeling depressed or something like that. So, that's where I think these large language models come into place, because they can analyze what you're telling them, what you're giving them, especially long form. And that's one of the reasons why, we created this AI coach, where you can talk to the AI coach for like an hour or so, and it can analyze every single word you say against a memory, against a lot of literature, and find patterns. And it's cool shit. So we'll talk about it later, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, but as you say, the benefit there is you're essentially you're taking human error out of the equation. That AI is always going to be performing 100% because it doesn't have human error. And
I mean, not to be it's not an alternative to a real therapy, by the way.
No, of course not.
It's just, it's like, it's
but
a cool
just as,
shit, and I think we're going to get there. Yeah.
The benefit, contrasting it, certainly.
Right.
There are benefits that you don't get with a, quote unquote regular therapist, I guess.
Right. So I guess I'll start this by, I remember it, if I remember correctly, a long time ago, you wrote publicly that you were super depressed. Right. And you were put on some kind of antidepressant by some doctor, maybe in Australia. And then it kind of like screwed up your ability to sleep for a long, long time. And you were not yourself. And then, you got out of those medication and to a better place. It was a long time ago, back when I used to use Facebook. So Jesus Christ.
Yeah, we're talking like a decade ago, I think.
Yeah,
probably.
a decade ago.
Because I think that happened around the time I started, or maybe 8 or 9 years, because I think it happened just after I started training MMA, which was, that was like 8 and, that was like the beginning of 2016. So somewhere in 2016 probably was that time frame. And
so what really happened there?
Well, so I had struggled with depression from the time I was a kid, like quite severely,
right?
Very intensely. And I think to add to it, there's a lot of, there's always a lot of sort of factors that influences. So, in my case, I was not particularly socially well adjusted. I was an only child, and there were other things going into that. And then I was also, and still am, very sensitive emotionally and things like that. And, that's a double-edged sword. There are a lot of great things about that. And as you become an adult, I think, because where I grew up was kind of like small town Australia. And
yeah, there's nothing there.
Well, not just that. It's, it's a little bit backward in some ways. So, for example, even in the 90s or the early 2000s, a lot of people were like, oh, like antidepressants or, mental health drugs, that's like, there's something serious. To them, that there are a lot of people on those drugs and it helps them function reasonably well, and it's just like, okay. I mean, and I could still kind of function without them. I was just miserable, so, but most people don't see that. Most people don't know that. You just see, people would see me when I would be out. And obviously, if I'm out of the house, I have a certain level of functionality, because if I'm just having a terrible day, I'm just going to stay inside. No one sees me. No one talks to me. No one knows, So when you're out and about, you're already kind of like halfway to your best. And then, people just don't see that side of things and what's happening.
Right. I mean, I remember like you had pretty good life back then. You were a copywriter. You were making decent money. You had a relationship. You had like a house that you bought. And, technically everything was looking fantastic. And you kind of seemed like a guy who had his shit together, right?
Yeah.
But back in your personal life, there were things going on that
Uh-huh.
nobody was aware of. Like, okay, you have quite significant depression. And there were
Yeah.
signs that I could notice. Like, for example, I would notice that when you have like a bout of depression or extreme anxiety going on, you would go out there and, really hyper focus or just distract yourself by either playing too much video game, right?
Yeah.
Or, like making plans or doing stuff like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah, I did bake to cope it at some, cope emotionally at some points. That's true. And then
Right.
I ate that baking to cope emotionally. So, thank God I was doing as much MMA training as I was at the time. Otherwise, I would have
All
been
right.
300 pounds. But yeah, I mean, that was all going on. From the outside looking in, everything looks great.
Yeah.
But
So you might see a lot of these people who are like super successful, they have their shit together, but in their
Uh-huh.
personal life, they might be going through something you have no idea.
Yeah.
Right? Like extreme depression, extreme anxiety. And I don't really know anybody who's like quite successful who does not have anxiety. It's just, yeah.
I think for the most part, anxiety is a part of the human condition in a sense,
I mean, it's
like,
normal. It's just like if without anxiety, you will likely die.
yeah.
Right?
I mean, and look, I don't, I'm not a geneticist, and my understanding is this isn't quite proven. It's just a very strong theory. But if we look at the theory of evolution, the concept that, okay, it's evolved this way potentially for a reason. That anxiety,
Yep.
like it did keep us alive. It didn't make us happy, but it kept us alive, for saber-toothed tigers or whatever we were dealing with at that point, Nowadays, we're in a very different environment. Nowadays, we have supermarkets and we have almost all of us has a house to live in with a door that locks, Overall, compared to, thousands of years ago, we've never really been safer or healthier or had more conveniences, and even as much as we like to decry the level of social safety nets in, well, pretty much any developed country, really, the citizens are going to complain about and say it should be better. But the truth is, you take the United States, for example, we do have a lot of welfare programs. Like very rarely are people absolutely not able to eat or something like that. So
Right.
the role that anxiety played a long time ago was useful.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, back in the day,
Nowadays,
yeah, you could die. Right.
maybe less so, because it's obviously, things have changed. We're not a hunter-gatherer society anymore, as for one thing, and tons of others.
Yeah. So you look at the news, you look at social media, and there's
Uh-huh.
always a sense of impending doom. And you read that
Always.
news,
Always.
and it kind of freaks you out, and
Uh-huh.
bad things happen as a result, right? There
Yeah.
are other sources of anxiety as well, but like it's just the way we're wired, and if we don't
Yeah.
really know how to manage all that
Uh-huh.
stuff, you're going to have a hard time. And especially when you're like in business, when
Uh-huh.
everything is volatile, when you
Yes.
have, certain, mental blocks in place, which I'll
Uh-huh.
talk about in a bit, right? Like, for example,
Uh-huh.
we call them thought traps, like all or nothing thinking and labeling
Yes.
thing and,
Yeah. And I would
jump
even
into
add that.
conclusion. Yeah.
I would even add that. It's kind of even worse than just our anxiety because, let's face it, the rise of the internet and social media has given us a few things. One of those things is we get such incredible granular data on what people are doing and how, and that we can extrapolate to see how our content is performing in terms of engagement or things like that. I mean, the classic example, Facebook, likes, shares, whatever, But, there, and then, when you get in, as you and I know, because we're in business and we had to know a little bit of marketing stuff, and I was a direct response copywriter, which is about psychology, like we're incentivized as a society to keep people anxious because the things that make them anxious get clicks and they get talked about and they get engagement.
Yeah. Anxiety is a sales driver. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the biggest one. Human beings have the two primary motivators. Is the first one is they move away from pain. And pain is not just physical pain, that means emotional pain as well. And anxiety is one of the biggest ones. Not having certainty, not knowing, that can be very, very, very
Right.
difficult for a lot of people to deal
People
with.
say, sex sells, but I think that's not really true. I think it just gets a lot of clicks, but it's
Yeah.
anxiety that really sells.
Mm-hmm. Well, even
So
in this, if we want to take
yeah.
the sex example, I mean, look what sells there. It's mostly, it's stuff like, for example, Viagra, which is, again, sold on anxiety. Hey, what's going to happen if you're with someone you really care about or someone you really want to, get this going with, and things just don't work out the way you want them to, and this could happen and that could happen and that could happen. So, you should probably go get a prescription for Viagra right now, right? And that's like, this is so baked into
Terrible
our
example,
society.
by the way.
I think it's a great example, but hey,
All right.
whatever. I think like the point I'm making is that, like you're saying, anxiety is a strong driving factor. It's a strong motivating factor for human action. And people who want to influence human action, which is honestly most of us to some degree in some way during our lives or during our day-to-day, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at the prepper industry, right? Prepper niche. Everybody's like preparing for the doom and gloom and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And it can work really well because people are anxious. The world's going to end and they got to be ready.
Yeah. And to give context, when you're saying prepper, what you mean is the doomsday preparation kind of the people selling stuff online to like fill a bunker or something like that. Like, here's all your freeze-dried food and your, water and whatever. And you're right. I know people who have that stuff, and I would say probably, well, there you go, and I would say in my experience, probably 4 out of 5 of them are just miserable balls of anxiety. And then there are people like you, and I have a couple other friends who are less, but yeah.
Yeah. OpenAI, Sam Altman, he has like a huge like doomsday bunker, and he prepares all that stuff. And like he's preparing for the end of the world, and he's a prepper.
Yep.
And with his boyfriend somewhere in California, which is a terrible place to be if you're like a doomsday guy. But
yeah, that's probably not the spot I'd pick, but hey, that's his life to lead. So
that's the thing, people always catastrophize quite a lot, like
and they spiraling catastrophize,
jumping to the worst conclusion with no like little to no evidence, like hey, that little blemish, it must be melanoma, or this little pain that I have must be, might be dying. Yeah. It happens quite a lot, and you got to deal with it. So, yeah. So,
100%.
Let's talk about childhood trauma. So, because the reason why I want to talk about this is a lot of stuff that we go through today is learned behavior, right? We don't like develop anxiety out of the blue. It's like, how we respond to things. And a lot of this stems from childhood trauma. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your mom or dad were abusive emotionally or physically. The trauma could be, anything. It could be, just though, it could be something at school. It could be something, like the way somebody reacted or, whatever.
Yeah, it can be a very innocuous thing in a lot of contexts that just for whatever reason really made an impact on you at a developing point. And the really interesting thing that I found about childhood trauma is the most, like the time of your life where most of your kind of natural inclinations are set to things like how anxious you might be or how aggressive you might be or whatever we want to, just kind of your natural tendencies. That happens in the first 6 to 8 weeks of being born. So most of us don't remember any of that. So if you grow up and you're like, I don't know why I'm this way or why I'm that way, well, maybe something happened back then. And then apparently the second most important one is up to about 7 years of age.
Right. So, a lot of these things we don't really even remember.
Exactly. You ask how many memories do you have like of before you were 7? I have maybe a handful,
Right.
And yet
it gets worse if you're bullied.
Yeah, exactly. And yet that is essentially what will, set our tendencies for life, So it's amazing how much of an impact that has. And like you say, trauma does not have to be a capital letter T. It doesn't have to be my parents beat me or they screamed at me or they were emotionally abusive or anything like that. It can even just be, my dad worked a lot and he was stressed. So I learned that, the thing to do is be stressed about work because as children and, we can't really, we don't have the abilities to differentiate whether that's a good or bad thing. We don't have that. And I don't think even if we did, it would really matter because it just kind of gets set in there, you know?
Yeah, like with me, I was taught that if you do not get admission in that particular school, or you do not pass that
Definitely.
test with that specific grades, it's all over for you. Like you're just gonna be on the street. You're never gonna get a job. You're gonna be miserable. You're literally gonna die or whatever. Stuff like that. People catastrophize on you as well, especially your parents. Sometimes, in my case, my mom was super emotionally abusive with my academic career. Right, shit like that happens all the fucking time.
Mine too, actually, which is interesting. And
you cannot really do anything to satisfy them, right? You could fucking, I don't know, go to fucking Mars, and they would still like belittle you, right?
Yeah, you could find a cure to cancer, and they'd be like, "Well, you should have done it 3 weeks ago, not now."
Yeah,
why did it take you so?
Asian parents are like that, but I think that's a stereotype.
Yeah, no, it is a stereotype, and from what I understand, it especially people who, for example, friends of mine who their parents emigrated to the United States from China or Korea or whatever, overwhelmingly that's kind of been their experience that they have relayed to me, that it's a real thing. And
and their parents might have their own trauma from their own childhood, and
they can't none of us walk away without trauma. And that's the
journey
thing, right?
to being an immigrant is quite difficult, especially if you're from these countries. I am from one of these shithole countries, so I know how difficult things can be.
Yes.
And it's one of the reasons why I think raising kids is incredibly difficult.
I think it's the it's one of those things that literally almost anyone can do, because unless you've got some kind of medical condition, like we're wired to have kids. That's the single most important thing for continuation of species. Yet it's one of the hardest things to do well, and even the best parents in the world are going to have kids who are messed up in some kind of way, who have some kind of trauma. And that's just, you just cannot escape that. There is never, ever, ever going to be a situation where someone gets away with that. I've met people who don't have a ton of it, who, like for however it ended up, kind of got through childhood without a lot of that, but they still have their stuff. Everyone has their trauma.
Right. When I was a kid, I had like this not school bully, I guess I would say a normal bully, although he was not really, I didn't got that much bully, but he was kind of like bully to other people.
Fair.
But, after looking back, and he had a terrible house. Like he got bullied by his dad quite frequently. So and you think that you're like instilling discipline in your kids or something like that. It's super fucking hard, man. Like,
very difficult.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And even going back to that, talking about the quote unquote Asian parents or the tiger moms or whatever that we also both had, despite neither of us being Asian, that usually, not always, but usually that is coming from a good and loving place. That is saying, hey, I want you to have every available opportunity in this world. I don't want you to screw around, in high school, and then your whole life's screwed because you just couldn't focus for 4 years, so they have kind of a means justify the ends approach. And also, we have to remember that people listening to this podcast, most of us are going to be quite, we understand the importance and the value of mental health, and that it's a real thing. In many, many, many countries and cultures, even including many parts of the United States, that's, I was even talking to a friend of mine the other day who's in his early 50s, and he was like, yeah, when I was growing up, that like therapists weren't a thing. We just, that was like, you had, if you went and saw a shrink, you're a crazy person. Like, is this person going to flip out and, gun down a mall or something kind of person? Yeah. Obviously, if things have things have gone on, we've developed an understanding, and that understanding kind of disseminates through the population.
Not really in like most other countries in the world. Like, for example,
exactly
in Arabic countries or South Asian countries, they still believe that if you go to a therapist or if you go to a psychiatrist, you must be really fucking crazy or a lunatic.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, it's largely Western society and developed nations that really have kind of been like, oh yeah, this is a good thing. And of course, I mean, I think there are probably exceptions to that rule. For example, I would imagine, I don't know for sure, I haven't researched this, but I imagine every Olympic team in the history of the world would have or at least, in the last however many years, would have a performance coach on staff, like essentially a therapist / psychologist who specializes in helping them deal with all the issues that might get in the way of them performing at their best. Things like if they're worried about how they're performing, it takes them out of the zone, or, their anxiety over doing something or not doing something,
Yeah,
all those
and
kinds of things.
folks, those who are listening, me and Dan are working on something really similar. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be magic, honestly.
Yeah. So like your childhood can have all kinds of fucked up shit. But, the good news is that neuroplasticity exists and you can change a lot of those things. And you don't really always have to rely on psychedelics for that, although they do really help if you have like a really good guide and, you're doing it in supervision and you're not like just doing it on your own.
Yeah.
But, you can still like use CBT. You can use a lot of these tools that we've developed and get amazing results. So why don't you talk about a little bit about psychedelics and how, like, I'm sure they've helped you. And, I know a lot of friends of mine who got a lot of value out of them. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, man, there's so many parts of this, but it's an interesting and timely question because I'm actually setting up to help someone very close to me to go through their first series of psychedelic experiences to kind of work through some of their stuff. So you mentioned neuroplasticity. And I think the issue with psychedelics in general is that, there's two major issues. One is that they were, my understanding is there wasn't a lot of restrictions on them in like the 50s and 60s. 60s was kind of a golden age of, like beginning to mess around with that stuff. And then, for whatever reason, a lot of restrictions and legal stuff was put in place. And then it kind of pushed it all underground. No one could really look at it. And as a result, a lot of the people who fall into psychedelics, I don't really vibe with because they're very unscientific people who kind of like live with their head in the clouds. And, that can be the kind of people it has historically for the last 30 years or whatever attracted. But what's amazing now is we are kind of starting to open that box again. We're starting to go through this research. We're doing all this, there are companies worth millions and millions and millions of dollars who are spearheading research into all
John
the
Hopkins
uses.
has a psychedelic division.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's been psilocybin therapy, psilocybin being the psychoactive ingredient in quote unquote magic mushrooms, has actually been, you can get legal psychedelic treatment in Oregon in the United States. And then there are other sort of, the term is entheogen, which kind of, the word entheo meaning something along the lines of God. So the concept is like these are quote unquote substances that help you connect with /see/ become one with God, whatever. Again, very kind of like intense term. But the point is stuff like this also encompasses things like MDMA, which, for example, Australia, I think this year or last year, actually legalized therapy for that as well. And what they're seeing is that these psychedelics are creating amazing results in different ways. For one, for people with PTSD, that's a big one, especially, veterans and stuff like that. But also people with childhood trauma. We're also seeing stuff like some people, I hesitate to use the word, they say curing, I'm not saying that. But some people are managing things like depression with them. Some people are managing anxiety with them. Some people getting rid of addiction, bad habits, like the sky is kind of the limit here. Right. But the important thing with them is that scientifically speaking, which is always where I like to come from, they, as you said, they dramatically aid in neuroplasticity. So for those listening who aren't aware, I'm going to drastically oversimplify this, but the way the brain works is it makes pathways, right? So when you have a thought, or let's say you're practicing like a kick in, like an MMA kick or something, like every time, or lifting a weight. And every time you do that, you're developing that neurological connection. This is why you'll see people who are obviously, guys who are just jacked in great shape, and you'll go get them to do a weird exercise that they'd never really done before. And they're like, I can't do this. It's not because they don't have the physical abilities. It's because their brain doesn't have a strong enough pathway yet. But as they continue doing that, that pathway gets stronger and bigger and thicker almost like a road that gets more deeply worn, right? Now that's a problem if that's an undesirable thing. For example, if you have an addiction, if you have anxiety, if you have PTSD around a certain thing that happened. So the beauty of what psychedelics help with is neuroplasticity. So you can take these, and it doesn't, to be really clear here, you don't have to quote unquote trip. Okay. There's a lot of benefit even in what they call microdosing, where you take a very, very small, maybe even a sub-perceptual dose. So you don't even notice it's having an effect on you. But even that has, a lot of studies have shown there's incredible benefits to neuroplasticity in that. And so therefore, when you're using those things, it helps you get in a space where things are a little less locked down, and you can kind of choose a little more to create your own mental constructions, maybe is the way I'd put that. So you can choose to, for case in point for me, I used to eat way too much. And really the only way,
eat a lot.
I eat a lot less than I used to. It's actually pretty good these days, right?
Yeah.
But
you look quite good.
Thanks. Yeah. And sometimes I do eat a lot if I train for like 3 or 4 hours, and I'm going to go, that's like 1,000+ calories I've burned and eat. But I used to eat emotionally. I used to eat to cope. And you're talking about me baking, and I'd be like, oh, great. Now I have a flan to eat, which is like 3,000 calories. And let me just dig into that with a spoon.
Jesus Christ.
It wasn't great. So there was a point last year in summer where we had a big storm roll through LA, and I, had the place to myself, and the rain was just lashing at the windows. It was this beautiful, primal kind of elemental event. And it kind of lined up for me. I was like, okay, this is the time. And I went on a journey, and I remember distinctly sitting there in my body and kind of feeling like, just being aware of my body and going, why do I have all this kind of fat hanging around? Like, I don't like this. This isn't helping me. And I came out of that trip, and, for the next, pretty much since then, my eating habits changed dramatically, and I didn't eat emotionally like I was doing. Now, I want to be clear here. Psychedelics are absolutely not for everyone. There is risk.
Yep.
So we need to be
can actually develop PTSD from doing psychedelics the wrong way. Because
even worse, paranoid schizophrenia can be.
If you're predisposed to schizophrenia, like if you have like a relative, like a blood relative who has schizophrenia or psychosis, you should probably avoid it. Or maybe just consult your physician, who is probably going to tell you not to take it.
Yeah,
because
certainly.
That's what all of them do.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially since it's not legal right now. And this, we're not going to get into this in this episode, but I just want to make everyone listening to this aware, because I've been extolling the virtues of psychedelics.
Right.
I just want to really make sure I counterbalance that with the reality that they're not for everyone. I think they're wonderful for a lot of people. But I know people who have, I'm pretty open about my experiences with this kind of stuff. So during my life, you connect with people and they're like, oh, hey, I've been thinking about this. Can I ask you some questions?
They're not for me. Yeah, I'm one of those people who's like, it's not for me. And it works for a lot of people. And I guess from my understanding is that a lot of these substances are neurotoxins. So they fuck up your neurons, and they destroy like some connections or something like that.
Well, they're definitely changing things.
As the brain heals itself, right? It, recalibrates the whole thing and just develops new pathway based on your current modality.
Yes.
Right? Like where you want to go. This is why, having the right guide or a therapist and all those things are critical when you're doing any of these things.
Yeah, you need guide. I believe very strongly that this is why I'm excited that more of this stuff is coming out, because now we're going to have much better benchmarks of like what to do, not what to do, and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
But yeah, I just really wanted to make that
better way
clear.
to implement these types of therapies in our lives as well. Instead of just, like popping a mushroom that you bought from somebody, some shady looking guy with a long beard, and, all of a sudden you have PTSD.
Yeah. And, the last thing I'll kind of say on this, unless you want me to keep going, but this is particularly just one of my bugbears, that if you talk to people who do a lot of psychedelics, you hear this phrase, oh, the medicine knows. The medicine knows what you need. And that always infuriates me. It infuriates me because it's such a goddamn cop-out. It is so easy. So if you have that answer, suddenly we don't have to try and figure out why this works or how this works or what's this doing. It's just really, it's kind of like the same as like, oh, God did it. And I'm certainly not decrying anyone's religious beliefs because I have some, beliefs of my own. That's not my point. My point is, those people who are just like, why does this happen? Oh, well, God did it. Like how does electricity work? I don't know. God makes it happen.
Yeah.
Now, if you believe in God, that's true.
Folks. Yeah.
But there's still a scientific element to this of like, okay, this is how it works, right? So
yep, there's a cause and effect.
Exactly. And especially with psychedelics, we're still learning a lot about them. And there's some really exciting, promising researching coming out, and there's some really cool stuff happening with it. But, there's still a lot we don't know, and it has to be treated with a certain level of respect and maybe in caution.
Yep. A lot of Silicon Valley bros got fucked up with ayahuasca lately, doing it incorrectly because they thought that they'll discover themselves or rediscover themselves and come out as a visionary on the other end. And all it did was just ended up fucking up their own startups and, just completely going off the ramp.
Yeah.
And,
actually, I'll add one more thing really quickly. For anyone who's thinking about doing this or is like kind of in the exploration phase of that, talk to someone who knows what they're doing. And here's your litmus test of like, is this person like worth listening to? And they should be able to explain things. They should be able to give you some kind of like logical grounded answer to the whys and whats. If they go into the, it's just like the medicine knows, man, just take what you feel or stuff like that. That's a really good sign that that is not someone that you want to be taking advice from when you're new to this stuff. I can speak to those people and kind of pass and understand and like interpret what they're meaning from that. People who are new to this will not be able to. And so I really just wanted to, kind of drop my little cautionary tale in there.
Right. So we're probably going to try and see if lawyers approve this. Maybe bring some of the experts on the coaching platform, and you guys can probably hire somebody if you want to talk about this over there on that platform and, see how it goes. So that was an interesting conversation, by the way. I learned a lot myself, actually. So that was a really
interesting.
Be
a service.
Right. So I'm thinking, hold on a sec. So guys, that was the part 1 of my conversation with Daniel. Now, we're going to split this in 2 parts because it was getting a little bit longer. And if you'd like to listen to 2-hour podcasts, let me know and I'll upload the whole thing. So you're going to see the next part next week. Or if you already are on this podcast, like on this episode, and that one is already out, you can just hit the next button and, listen to the conversation instantly. We are going to talk about over preparation, preparing for the worst, the all or nothing kind of mentality, intolerance of uncertainty, distractions using video games, some supplements like saffron extract, diet and exercise, using martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a distraction, and other stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And I'll see you next week, or maybe on the next episode if that one is already out. So you can just hit the next button and see.